Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and I'm really excited to talk to you about Mechilah. Let's remind ourselves what Mechilah is. In the third parak of Bava Batra, Chesed Batim, we talk about the fact that you can acquire a piece of land by squatting on it without any protest from the original owner for 3 years. And the reason why that is so is because we assume that there is a correlation between your squatting there without protest and a mechilah, a waiving of rights on the part of the person who owned the property. And it's interesting because a few weeks ago, we did a shiur on Chezkat Gimel Shanim. We did a shiur on the question of how does Chezkat Gimel Shanim work, or more, why does Chezkat Gimel Shanim work? And we had 3 different approaches. One reason why we thought Chezkat Gimel Shanim might work is simply a public policy reason, right? It is good practice not to require somebody who is living on a piece of land after 3 years to still have the shtar, to still have the contract, because the likelihood is they won't have it anymore. And so it's good public policy to say if somebody's been living there for 3 years without protest, that's good enough in lieu of a shtar. A second is that we said that the living on the land was actually itself a kinyan, right? Living on the land for 3 years was a kinyan, similar to, but much more drawn out, much more extended, similar to the idea that when I am holding this Diet Coke, that means that I am muchzeket on it. I am now holding it. It is mine. Similarly, living on that land for that extended period of time, that actually effectuates a kinyan. It effectuates an acquisition on my part. The third is that this 3 years is actually a raya. These 3 years of living here, they're not the kinyan. The kinyan is not done primarily by the person sitting there and living on it. They are a raya. They are a proof. They are evidence that the original owner actually has given up their rights, right? That at some point, the original owner sold this, right? Now, the idea that this is a raya, this is evidence that the original owner sold this to the person who's living there now, is really the piece that focuses the most on the question of Mechilah, of the idea that the original owner has waived rights to the property. Now, today in our shiur, we've come across, as we go through the third parak of Bava Batra, we've come across a case that actually is talking specifically about Mechilah, that affords us the opportunity to look into the concept of Mechilah itself. What is the concept of Mechilah? Okay, now it's a little bit of a backdoor, because the way we're getting into the concept is through an example of Mechilah b'taot, a mistaken case of Mechilah, right? And that is on Bava Batra Mem Aleph, we have the case of Rav Anan. Rav Anan had a, some sort of water flood on his land. He had to rebuild the wall that was the boundary between his land and his neighbor's land. And it turns out that he actually rebuilt the wall on his neighbor's land, not on purpose. And when they realize that, he goes before Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman says, you got to return the land. And Rav Anan says, well, why do I have to return the land? I have a chazakah on it, right? And why do I have a chazakah on it? So the possibility is the reason why I have a chazakah on it is maybe because the other side saw me build this and had no qualms about it. And the Gemara says, no, that can't happen immediately. This wasn't 3 years. But he says, even if it wasn't 3 years, it seems to be that the other side was mochel. The other side gave up their rights to it. They even helped me build this wall. And the answer that Rav Nachman gives to Rav Anan, even though it seems that there was Mechilah on the part of the other property owner, whose property your wall is now on, because they actually helped you put up this wall. The issue is, says Rav Nachman, and I want to look at this inside. I'm just sharing right now. He says, Amar Le, he says, Mechilah b'totu. It was a mistaken Mechilah, right? This other party waived their rights to the land, not realizing that it was their land. At gufach, you yourself, ihava yadat lo avadit. You wouldn't have done this yourself had you known that this was going to be on the other person's property. Kiheche da'at lo hava yadat, just like you didn't know that it was on the other person's property. Hu nami lo hava yadat. They also didn't know that it was on their property. So this is kind of an interesting example because it seems like the fact that both Rav Anan and the other homeowner didn't know, or landowner didn't know, that this wall was now on the property of the other landowner. That's what makes it not work. Does that mean that Mechilah b'taot always doesn't work? Now, I think this is a really interesting question because in this case of Mechilah b'taot, it's not just that the person who's supposed to be mochel didn't know that there was what to be mochel on because they didn't know that it was their property. So it was like an accidental, ipso facto Mechilah that they didn't protest, but they didn't actually know. But in this case, it wasn't just that they didn't know. Rav Anan, the one who seemed to be taking some of their property by building a wall on it, also didn't know, right? So it's an interesting case because it's not just a regular Mechilah b'taot case, but nonetheless, this becomes sort of a ground zero for starting to talk about Mechilah and Mechilah b'taot. So I want to look at another case where the Gemara talks about Mechilah b'taot and see, let's continue to layer this conversation. So far, we have an example of Mechilah b'taot that is both sides have made a ta'ut. Neither side knew that there was Mechilah required because they were taking someone else's land, or that their land was taken and therefore they were giving Mechilah. But when you look in the Gemara in Bava Batra in Ezehu Neshech, for those who remember back, we see another example of Mechilah b'taot. And let's take a look at it. So there's a Mishnah that starts in Perek Hey of Bava Batra, Hilvo al sadehu. Let's say somebody lent money to somebody else and made that somebody else's sadeh into the collateral, right? Va'amarlo, and the Malva said, if you don't pay me back from now until 3 years from now, harehi shali, your sadeh belongs to me. So the Mishnah says, harehi shalo, it works, right? And Baitus ben Zonin used to do this. So that's what the Mishnah says. You make a milva, you make a loan, and the collateral is a piece of land. 3 years pass, the lova doesn't pay back, the land reverts to the malveh. But the Gemara in Bava Batra and Samech Vav Amud Bet brings up a concept that actually undermines this, and the concept is asmachta. Selling something that isn't selling the existence of it right now, but is for some possibility in the future, an asmachta. And the Gemara has a machloket. Do we say asmachta kanya or asmachta lo kanya? Do we say that such a kind of acquisition works or it doesn't work, right? I want to sell to you all the peyrot that will grow from X tree, right? That's not selling you something that exists right now. It's selling you, I want to acquire this land if you don't pay me within 3 years. It's not something right now. It's if something else happens, right? So Rav Nachman says, okay. And remember, it's the same Rav Nachman from our case in Bava Batra who said, this is Mechilah b'taot, and it's a taot on both sides. So we don't count the Mechilah, and it's got to go back. So Amar Rav Nachman says, Hashta da Amar Rabbanan asmachta lo kanya. By the way, Now, if we paskin like Rabbanon that asmachta cannot effectuate a kinyan, then guess what? Hadra ara, hadra pere. If that malve took that land or ate from it, the land goes back to the love and the payroll go back to the love. That kinyan does not get affected. Absolutely not, right? Which is interesting because I want you to think about this. That means that for some amount of time, the malva has been eating off the land, has been living on the land, and presumably the love has been totally mochel, has waived their rights to that land, presumably, right? So what about the Mechilah of the love? Well, the Mechilah of the love was a mistake because the love didn't realize asmachta lokanya, that kinyan should never have been effectuated. So when Rav Nachman says, I want the malvet to give back the land and give back the value of the parrot that they've eaten from the land, because asmachta lokanya, what is he basically saying? Lamemra, this savar Rav Nachman Mechilah b'tod lahavi Mechilah. Clearly, Rav Nachman thinks that mistaken Mechilah on the part of his love, who thought, okay, we made this condition that if I don't pay back, the land belongs to the malvet, without knowing, no, asmachta lokanya, that actually has no bearing. That kinyan doesn't actually take place, right? You mistakenly were mochel your rights to it. And Rav Nachman says, so the malva has to pay you back. What does that sound like? Mechilah b'tod lahavi Mechilah. The mistaken Mechilah on the part of the love, that's not Mechilah, right? So I want us to think about this. The idea that if somebody out of mistaken knowledge, they didn't know that this was their property on which a wall was being built, or out of ignorance, they didn't know that an asmachta can't effectuate a kinyan. And so when the malva said, if you don't pay me within 3 years, I get this land, right? You didn't know that that's not true, and therefore you never protested. That Mechilah, how can we count that as Mechilah in Halakha? That wouldn't be fair, right? Mechilah should be something where there's an awareness on the part of the person who has to waive their rights, of what they're waiving and why they're waiving, right? Like, there has to be some awareness. But then the Gemara says, well, actually, we do actually have a case where it seems like Rav Nachman thinks that Mechilah b'tod could be Mechilah. Uh-oh. V'ha itmar. What about the following case? Hamochar perot dekel lechavero. Somebody sells fruit of a palm tree to somebody else. Amar Rav Huna achelo bal olam yachol lachzor bo. Rav Huna says, if the fruits aren't grown yet, right, that you can retract, you can renege on the sale. Mi shabal olam ein yachol lachzor bo. But if they're already in existence, if they come into existence, or when they come into existence, you can't retract on the sale anymore. And Rav Nachman says, Af mi shabo la'olam yachol lachzor bo. Even once they come into existence, you can cancel the sale. But look at what he says. But Rav Nachman says, Modina, I admit the shamit v'achel, that if the buyer already ate some of the fruit, lo mapkinan minei, we don't make them pay back for it. Why not? If the buyer already ate some of the fruit, we don't make them pay back. But it was Mechilah b'tod. They should know they're allowed to cancel the sale. This is not fair. They didn't know. They're allowed to cancel the sale. Why are you not making the person who ate the payroll, even though the sale is allowed to be canceled, why are you not making them pay back? So the Gemara says, Hatam zvini hachalva. Well, that's in the case of a sale, and that's in the case of a what's the word? Of a loan. Meaning, in the case of a sale, we would say Mechilah b'tod counts as Mechilah, but in the case of a loan, we wouldn't say Mechilah b'tod counts as Mechilah. This is a little confusing. right? This is a little confusing. Now, I want to make something very clear. We do say in general that a kinyan betod, right? That such a kinyan doesn't work, right? So the fact that we're even having this conversation of whether Mechilah betod works or doesn't work makes us ask the question of, is Mechilah another type of kinyan where tod shouldn't work, or is Mechilah something else, right? So here we have three cases. We had one case with the wall with Ravanan, where neither party knew that there was squatting going on. And so they didn't know they needed Mechilah, and they didn't know that they were doing Mechilah. Then we have in the Gemara in Bava Batra the case of land. If you don't pay me back, the Malva says, I get the land. And we say, that's also Mechilah betod, because the Lova didn't realize that the asmachta doesn't work to effectuate a kinyan. And therefore, the Malva has to pay back if they ate anything. And then we have a third case, which is in a case of selling fruit from a tree, that even though in theory, the seller should be able to go back and renege, Rav Nachman says, if the buyer already ate from it, it's good enough. And you don't take money from them. It's Mechilah betod. So what's going on? So we have three cases, and it's hard to know what to do here. Like, is the default that in general we say Mechilah betod is not Mechilah, but there is this one weird case of selling peyrot of a palm tree, where we say the Mechilah betod works, right? Or is the default Mechilah betod works, and there are a few cases like this halva example, and maybe like this wall where neither side knew, where we say Mechilah betod doesn't work, right? And if we say that the default is Mechilah betod works, what are we saying about Mechilah and what it means? And if we say the default of Mechilah betod doesn't work, what are we saying about what Mechilah means, right? So I'll make it very simple. This is a machloket between Rashi and Tosfot. It seems like Tosfot think that the basic concept is Mechilah betod does not work, right? But there may be a case where it might work, because even if the seller knew that they were being mochel, even if they were able to they would have been able to argue to get their stuff back, they would have wanted to be mochel anyway, because it makes them look good as a seller, right? Like, it's good business. It's good business, the one case where we said Mechilah betod works, which is where I was selling fruits of a tree and the consumer already ate. It's good business for me not to charge them. So that's why Mechilah betod worked there, because even if I knew about the Mechilah, I would have been fine with it. I would have been fine with it, right? So it's sort of like Mechilah still is this concept of, it's the da'at of the person that's required. They have to know what it is that they're in for. So usually Mechilah betod doesn't work, so if they're missing information. But if it's a situation where they're missing information, but even if they had the information, they would want to be mochel anyway, we still consider that Mechilah, right? Now, if that's the case, and that's what the Balei Tosfos do, and I include it in the sources, people can look at it when they want. If that's the case, then what we have here is like Mechilah is very much like a kinyan, right? Like when you have a kinyan, you need the dat makna, you need the interest and motivation and intentionality of the one who is giving over acquisition of something that belongs to them, right? Similarly, with Mechilah, they really should know what they're doing. So if they don't know, for example, they didn't know that the wall was in their courtyard, in their yard, on their property, or they didn't realize that an asmachta can't cause a kinyan, then in generally we say that Mechilah doesn't work. But if you have a situation where it's true, they didn't know, they didn't realize that they could necessarily, change their mind. But the truth is, even if they had known they could change their mind, they still would have wanted to be milchel because it's good business, it's smart business. People look at you as a generous and trustworthy, really, salesperson. So you ate a few of my extra fruits, that's fine, right? Then we would say it works, not because we don't care about the dat of the mocher, but because we think the dat of the mocher would have wanted this, right? So that's like very understandable. And then Mechilah is very similar to kinyan. What I think is a stranger case is the opinion of Rashi, which is he thinks that in general, Mechilah b'tot works. Mechilah b'tot is considered Mechilah. And in the two cases here that we looked at in Bava Batra with the wall, and in Bava Metzia with the halva, there are particular reasons why it doesn't work. So let's just look at Rashi for a minute. Second. Okay. Here we go. Okay, let's look at Rashi for a second here. So Rashi says, commenting on what it says in Bava Metzia, that the difference between the case of mocher perot of a dekel, where we say you don't charge the buyer money for eating from the fruits, even though that's Mechilah b'tot, as opposed to when you take out a milva, you take out a loan, and the malva says, I'm going to take your land, I acquire your land if you don't pay me within 3 years, which is also a Mechilah b'tot, but we say that actually doesn't work. Rav Nachman wants the malva to pay back even the payroll that they ate already, right? So he says, what's the difference? Hachalvahi, in the case of halva, umerse keribit. The problem in the case of the milva is not that it's Mechilah b'tot, it's that it looks like ribbit. It looks like ribbit, right? Somebody lent you money and now they're eating payroll off your land. Doesn't look right. But in general, Mechilah b'tot should work. Now, explain to me the logic of this. Why would Mechilah b'tot? Why would the transaction work if it was b'tot? Right? Like, if I do a kinyan b'tot, no way, right? Like, mekach tod is a very important concept in Halakha. You didn't understand all the details, so the transaction is not valid. And Rashi says, no, in the case of the milva, it's not valid because it looks like ribbit, no good, right? And of course, he'd have another answer for the question of why the wall didn't matter, right? Why in the wall case, Mechilah b'tot doesn't work. Not because it's Mechilah b'tot, but maybe because neither side of them knew, right? But really, the baseline is the mocher perot b'dekel, where we say Mechilah b'tot is totally Mechilah. So what's the logic of this? So interestingly enough, the Agoda Ashri that you can find giving you comments on the Rush in the back of your Gemara, he suggests that what we're talking about here is Yeush. Mechilah is similar to the concept of Yeush. It's not, don't think of it in the category of kinyanim, where you need the dat makna, you need the intention of the person who's giving acquisition of their stuff to somebody else, right? In Mekach u'Memkar. Think of it, go back to Bava Metzia, think of it in the world of Yeush. It requires something a little bit less. And because it's like Yeush, even Mechilah b'tot is good enough, even if you don't have all the information, right? So the Agoda Ashri is here, and people should read it on their own when they have time. But the Ketzot HaChoshen puts it really succinctly in a helpful way. Ubeir Devarav, this is what he means. He's explaining the Agoda Ashri. Mishum di Yeush afilu b'tot mahani. Yeush even mistakenly works, right? Like Yeush actually does affect a partial, well, it depends, if we're talking about an aveda in a lost object, it affects acquisition, right? The Yeush de aveda nami b'totu, because oftentimes Yeush, when it comes to a missing object, is also based on not knowing everything. De'ilu havayada hechan ha'aveda, because if they knew that the aveda was down the block, lo hava miyayish, they never would have had yayush, right? Like yayush often comes with not knowing all of the details. So if Mechilah bitot, instead of comparing Mechilah to kinyan, if we compare Mechilah, waiving your rights, to yayush, then maybe we can understand why, even if you're missing some information, that doesn't undermine the Mechilah. V'kevan detama de Mechilah bitot l'Rav Nachman mahani hainu mishum yayush balim. If it is the case that since Mechilah bitot for Rav Nachman, it can work in the case of the Perot Dekel, because of the Yeush that is experienced by the Balim. Imkain hachashapir ka'amar Rav Nachman. That will explain to me why, in the case of Rav Anan, our original case in Bava Batra, Rav Nachman says, Ki hecha da'at lo yadat, hu nami lo yada. Why, in the case of what looked like a simple Mechilah bitot, in the case of Bava Batra, why Rav Nachman says, oh, no, just like you didn't know about it, that it was on his land, he didn't know about it. Why? V'im kain havale, v'im kain havale Mechilah bitot, then it should be Mechilah bitot, daha mitzad yeush v'hefger lo zacha Ravanan. Because if what we're dealing with is yeush as our exemplar, it's one thing for the original owner to have yeush based on a tot. But what does that do? The yeush makes the object hefker, and then the other party can be zocha on it. But the problem is Ravanan can't be zocha on it. Kevan de lo yada hazocha, because he didn't know either that it had been on the other party's side and that now it was hefker. Ubehefker, and when it comes to hefker, hecha de savar shehu shalo, if somebody believes that hefker is theirs, lo kana, right? They don't acquire it, right? So this is a totally different model, right? We have two different models for what Mechilah could be. If Mechilah is just like kinyan, then what we're talking about is effectuating the acquisition of something from one party directly to another. And in order to do that, you need the dat of the makna, you need the dat of the person who's giving away their acquisition. And therefore, Mechilah bitot shouldn't work except in some circumstance where even if they would have known, they would have wanted to do the Mechilah also. That's the position of Tosfot. But if we're comparing yeush, if we're comparing Mechilah not to a kinyan from one party to the other, but one party having yeush, one party despairing of getting something back, and thus the object then going into hefker, and then the other party being able to be zocha on it from hefker, the other party being able to get it out of hefker, then what you're talking about is something much, much, much less in terms of the requirement, much lower in terms of the requirement. You just need the basic concept of yeush. Yeush often, always, but often, maybe not always, but often comes from not knowing something, right? You don't know that it's down the block, so you have yeush from ever finding it. You don't know who picked it up, but it turns out they're sitting, somewhere close by. You don't even know. You have yeush. And when you have that yeush, it puts the thing into hefker, and then somebody else gets it out of hefker. So if we go back to our three cases, the situation of the mocher dekel case, Rashi would say, explain that by the Agot Ashri and Ketzora Choshen. They would say, when it comes to the mocher perot dekel case, it's okay that it was bitot. It's good enough to be yeush. And then the person who goes and eats the fruits, they're zocha from hefker. They're getting out of hefker. When it comes to the case of the wall, where Rav Anan built a wall accidentally on somebody else's property, it's true that somebody else, their Mechilah bitot should be enough, but now it's hefker. But guess what? Rabbanan doesn't know that it's hefker. He thinks it's already his. So you're not zocha on something from hefker if you think it's already yours. So therefore, it doesn't work. And then when you go back to the halva case, you're giving someone a milva and saying if they don't pay you back within 3 years, then you get their property, right? And that's not true because asmachta lokanya and they have Mechilah b'taot. In theory, that should have worked, but in practice, don't do it because it's mechse kiribit. It looks like taking interest, right? So these are two very different ways of thinking about Mechilah. And what I think I would leave you with is two things. Number one, it's interesting to see that if you look in the Yerushalmi, and I put the sources in there for anybody who wants to look, if you look in the Yerushalmi, there seems to be a machloket. Let's say you have Yeush B'tot. Yeush B'tot as in you thought, and this is the example, you thought that, I don't know, let's give an example, a shore muad, right? That you thought was going to get skila, and then it turns out that the Edim who said that the shore was nogeach, that the shore gored, were Edim Zomamin. So, the question of, did you as the owner of that shore release that shore into hefker because you had Yeush, you knew it was going to die? And therefore, if once they realized Edim Zomamin, anybody can go grab that shore. Or do we say, well, that was Yeush B'tot, you didn't know, you thought it was going out to be killed, but it's not, right? So I think that Gemara actually leads to a question about this whole logic. Well, Yeush is always B'tot. Well, there's Yeush B'tot and then there's Yeush B'tot, right? There's Yeush because you don't know that somebody around the corner picked it up, but then there's also Yeush because it was supposed to be taken out to be executed, and it's not being executed anymore because it turns out the Edim are Edim Zomamin. And the Bavli and Kritut, which actually seems to not have the machloket. It just says that even that kind of Yeush actually is considered Yeush, which is interesting, right? It doesn't have the possibility. Maybe Yeush B'tot, it's not Yeush, but that's just to continue thinking about. But Bigadol, from a conceptual perspective, what I think is interesting here is I might have said, like very clearly, anytime one party doesn't have the full details of the situation, they're ignorant of the idea that there's a loss on their part. They're ignorant of the halachot of asmachta being koneh or not koneh. Right? Like anytime there is a lack of information on one side, I would say the transaction shouldn't go through. I don't care if it's a kinyan, I don't care if it's a Mechilah. It shouldn't matter because people are missing information, right? But on the other hand, that's not necessarily where Rashi goes, right? That's maybe where Tosfot go. But maybe that's because we're coming from a perspective of kinyan and Mechilah are parallel. Or maybe we're coming from a perspective of anytime there's a tot, we shouldn't allow a transaction to be. But where Rashi goes and where the Hagoda Ashri goes and where the Ketzot Choshen go is really fascinating because they're basically saying you can't just answer this with a question of what happens when somebody doesn't have all the facts. It's more what happens in a case of kinyan, what happens in a case of Aveda, and which situation is more like which, right? Like, what are we going to parallel it to? Are we going to parallel it to a kinyan, or are we going to parallel it to Yeush from the world of Aveda? So I hope you enjoyed that little deep dive. Looking forward to learning with you soon.